So during this interview, I have the privilege of interviewing Professor Rupp. So after Professor Rupp received a Bachelor of Arts from Princeton and a Bachelor of Divinity from Yale Divinity School, he completed his PhD in religion at Harvard, focusing his research on religious pluralism. Professor Rupp then began an extensive career in academia, teaching at 3 universities, most notably at Harvard Divinity School, where he later became its dean. He is also President Emeritus of Rice and Columbia Universities. Following his retirement from academia from 2002 to 2013, Professor Rupp was CEO of the International Rescue Committee, which is perhaps the most influential NGO in the field of humanitarianism and refugee rights. Following his retirement from the IRC, he has remained engaged in nonprofit work, including at the Carnegie Institute for Ethics in International Affairs. Welcome, Professor Rupp. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be interviewed by you, Aidan.
Thank you. So for our first question, most of our audience are high school and college students. Was there a particular moment as a student yourself when you knew you wanted to study religion, or was it more of a gradual evolving process?
There wasn't any particular time. I was very actively involved in my church, and I was head of the youth program, which during my time in that role grew to over 100 students at the time. And I very much enjoyed that. But my father was an immigrant from Germany, and he told me in no uncertain terms that I would never put up with what ministers of Protestant churches in the United States were expected to put matters on their own. So I had this kind of skeptical view of what it would be like to be a minister. I was also very active in social, especially in the civil rights movement at the time. And so I thought that one way or another, I would be involved in civic engagement, human rights sorts of activities. And I thought I would go on and study religion, but I certainly was not completely clear that I was going to wind up becoming a minister.
Super interesting. As a graduate student at Harvard Divinity School, you studied Christianity and comparative religion. Could you expand on some of your early research and later work on religious pluralism?
Well, I from that early time on, I was very interested in the similarities and differences among religions. If I can just put it simply, there's a well-known cliche that the various religions are different paths to the same goal. And I quite early discovered that it's more accurate to say that each of the various religious traditions includes multiple paths to different goals. And I thought it was important to understand the ways in which within a nominally unified religious community, there was huge diversity. And that meant that the comparisons were not nearly as simple as they were usually set out to be. And the source of tensions was also not only between religious traditions, but within quite different positions within a single tradition. And that's not only the very large contrast, let's say, between Shia and Sunni Muslims, but much more fine-grained within Shia communities and within Sunni communities. And similarly with Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism or Christianity, we all know Catholics and there are differences between Catholics and Protestants, but there are also enormous differences within Catholicism and within Protestantism, not to mention Orthodox and other traditions. And so I became intrigued with the ways in which the similarities and differences within a tradition could be compared to similarities and differences between traditions. And that really excited me and intrigued me. And it's what led to my spending a year of my graduate work in Sri Lanka, because I was not going to become an expert on Sri Lanka. I was not going to learn all the relevant languages. Ceylon, it was then called, had the great advantage that English was spoken there. But it also was the version of Buddhism that I found most different from what I took as the usual characterization of Buddhism, which was much more shaped by Mahayana Buddhism. So the comparative religion in various ways all through my teaching and scholarship was of great interest to me.
I think, one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking there, was there a particular religious affiliation? Like, was it Buddhism that particularly drew you in, or broadly speaking, it was just sort of the comparisons between difference either within groups or between groups that was like engaging?
Well, I would have to say of the other than Christian traditions, I found Buddhist traditions the most interesting. But it in fact was more the case that I found the overall similarities and differences within traditions and comparisons among them interesting. And the one I focused on was Buddhist and Christian, but it was the divergence and overlap more than just Buddhism as a separate tradition on its own.
Yeah.
So I can't help telling the story about that, because when I was in Sri Lanka, or so then called Ceylon, I decided I would try to learn meditation, and I'm a bad prospect for meditation, as my family would report, because I'm quite impatient, and it's hard for me to sort of settle down and just do what it called insight meditation. But I had the good fortune of being able to have access to the most famous instructor in Theravada meditation in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka. His name was Nyanaponika Thera. He was actually an Orthodox Buddhist, Orthodox Jew, who fled the Nazi Germany, converted to Buddhism, and became a very highly regarded instructor in meditation. And so I had the good fortune of having him as a mentor. I would go out to his forest hermitage and would practice my meditation for as long as I could tolerate it. And then he was excited because we could then sit down and discuss. Spinoza was his favorite philosopher, and we would discuss it, a Jewish philosopher, as you know,
Yep.
and we would discuss it in German. And so I had this talk about overlapping traditions. Here I had an Orthodox Jew interested in Spinoza, a well-known authority in Theravada meditation, and we would discuss Spinoza in German.
In Ceylon too.
Yeah.
That's incredible. That's incredible. So you were deeply involved in academia for a really long time, both in teaching and administrative roles, before shifting into nonprofit work. What catalyzed that shift?
Well, you're right. It was a long time because I'd been involved in multiple institutions. And I would say what catalyzed it more than anything else is that I was turning 60. I thought I had one career left. This is when people really tended to retire at 65 or most 70. And I had enjoyed my experiences in higher education, and I had high regard for Harvard and for Columbia and for Rice. And so it was not because I was disenchanted, but I thought that I had time to have one more opportunity. And I didn't know what it would be. In fact, I did not want to be looking for other work while I was president of Columbia. So I did not have any idea what my next position would be when I announced my intention to resign a year later. And then I just started looking where I could have some impact for the remaining time that I had. And one of the people I talked to early in my beginning to just look at what opportunities were available, was former president of Princeton, very highly regarded man. We had a very long talk with a couple of glasses of wine. And at the end of it, he said to me, George, I don't know what you're going to wind up doing, but just from listening to what you're interested in, the one organization I can think of that really picks up most of what you discussed is an outfit called the International Rescue Committee. I had never heard of the International Rescue Committee and certainly had no connections there. But he said, right now they have a relatively new president. They seem happy with him, so that's not an opportunity, but you ought to look at other places that are like the IRC and pursue those, because I had talked about being interested in international development and having spent time in the developed world for most of my career, wanted to spend more time in the developing world and blah, 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 blah. So anyway, then I kept kind of smoking around, looking at what I might do. Some other opportunities sort of raised their heads a little bit. But when I was back in my office, just beginning my final year, the co-chair of the board at Columbia called me up and he said, "George, I know you're going to think that I'm crazy, but I wonder if there's any way you could be interested in the International Rescue Committee." And Jerry Spire was the person who called me. I said, "Well, Jerry, let me tell you a story." So I told him the story I just told you about the interview that I had with Bob Coheen, who had been the president of Princeton. And he said, "Well, okay, I guess you are interested. I've done my part of it. Let me put Catherine Farley, his spouse, on the line, because she's the chair of the search committee for the new president they're looking for." So in a very short time, the connections that I thought had no connections, and it turned out there were connections. And of course, the Rice senior staff were dubious. I'd never really worked in development. I hadn't been in the third world, except by the year I spent in Sri Lanka. And but I went and had an interview and talked to them, and I think they became convinced that I was actually serious about trying to make a difference in an organization like the IRC. And I was then offered the position not too much after that. And it was, I have to say, I loved being involved in very distinguished universities, but my favorite position was being the president of the International Rescue Committee. It's just a fantastic organization. My successor has made it even larger and more influential, and so it was a great place to be. I spent all my time in higher education going to the centers of high culture where there were prosperous alums, and then I had the opportunity to go to all the other interesting places in the world, which are the many more than just the ones where the developed countries and prosperous alums live.
Yeah, thank you. That's amazing. So I was wondering, for those listening who aren't already familiar, could you provide a brief description of the IRC, both in terms of like its mission and work?
Yes, and since I am completely empathetic with those who don't have much of a sense of it, because I didn't have a sense of it either before I went there. Although now it's, I think, quite substantially larger and more influential. The IRC was founded in 1933 at the suggestion of Albert Einstein, that it would be good to have a committee of notables in the US, he said in New York, that could work with counterparts in Europe to help rescue refugees from the Nazis. And it was founded in 1933. Now, that was at the very beginning of persecution of Nazis, but obviously could grow into much greater prominence as that accelerated. And it had very distinguished New Yorkers who were on that initial committee. That's why it was called the International, makes sense, Rescue, makes sense, Committee. Well, it was a committee of these very notable people. So that's where it started. And its founding mission then was helping refugees to escape persecution and getting back resettled in other countries and getting back on their feet. And so that's what we with the IRC did in a substantial matter for the first chunk of its history. But as time went on, and I'd have to say this really accelerated in my time. Maybe another little detail. When I first went to the IRC, my predecessors said, don't use the word development here. There are members of the board and the IRC community who feel strongly we shouldn't be involved in development. We should be involved in rescuing and resettling refugees. That was our core mission from the beginning. Well, as I visited many of our programs, it seemed clear to me that is important as rescuing and resettling refugees was, if we could do something to keep them from being driven out of their home countries, it would be a lot more valuable than just only resettling them. And so over time, the board came to agree that it was important for us to do very serious work internationally in order to have refugees be able to stay, have people who were potential refugees be able to stay in their own country. And so I say by the time I left the IRC, the scale of operations had tripled. It had been 150 million when I went. It was about 475 million by the time I left. But more importantly, we had 12,000 staff, and of the vast majority of them in other places than the United States. And 98% of the ones outside the United States were locals. We didn't just bring in a bunch of outsiders to try to, save the people, but we worked in training local community members to bring the kind of development services to their communities that would allow people to be able to flourish there rather than flee to somewhere else. And of those 12,000 people around the world, it's just a terrific feeling to know every day there are thousands of local staff who are working very hard to have their neighbors, their community members, be able to support themselves.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was not so brief.
Oh no, don't worry about it at all. I think people definitely would benefit from hearing about all the work the IRC does and the impacts it so obviously has too. So the IRC has been deeply involved in Southeast Asia for decades. During your time at the head of the IRC, there were a series of crises in Myanmar, including severe natural disasters, as well as what is argued to be genocide perpetrated by the government there. In response, there has been significant support from the international community, including from the IRC for Myanmar citizens. I know that the IRC only began its work in Myanmar in 2008. Was there any particular reason why operations began then rather than earlier, including in the early 2000s?
Well, Aidan, I hate to break this news to you because you're really obviously very well informed, but the one point you made that is accurate, although misleading. It is true that the IRC became involved directly in Myanmar only in 2008, but we were involved with refugees from Myanmar on the Thai border since 1975. And we were the principal caretaker of refugees, the Karen ethnic group in particular, that fled to the Thai border and were at that border for many years. And we worked with them to educate them, to prepare them to return, but the vast majority were not able to return, at least for very long periods of time. So we were very involved. And then when the tsunami, the cyclone hit in 2008, which was then during my time, I had already visited Myanmar on the Thai border before that. But when the cyclone hit, we decided we would do what we had not done before, because the Myanmar government was a very authoritarian, not to say militaristic government. But they were in such desperate need for help after Cyclone Nargis hit that we did send our workers in, and there were 800,000 refugees upended and hundreds of thousands people killed in Hurricane Nargis. And we worked very much with them to get them back on their feet, to provide water and sanitation and healthcare and education and so on. But then, much more crucially for our own identity, which we could serve as a relief operation, but we mostly were involved in relief and development, and then or rescuing refugees and resettling them. And at just that time, there was Myanmar is mostly Buddhist, but it has a fairly substantial Muslim minority. And they had been in Rohingya state, had been subjected to incredible burning of villages, dispossession of people. Many fled to Bangladesh because they didn't think they had any possible future. And so we wound up working quite aggressively in Rohingya state with these Muslim victims of Buddhist. It's hard for me as a student of Buddhism to see that this was a Buddhist majority that was subjecting a Muslim minority to terrible treatment. But we worked with them in terms of helping them to get back on their feet, get their healthcare and education and other services. And then also we wound up working in Bangladesh with refugees who had fled there. So we were involved in multiple ways in Myanmar after 2008, whereas for 20 or 30 years before that, we've been involved on the border of Myanmar and Thailand.
Yeah, thank you. I was aware of the IRC's operations in Thailand. I wasn't sure if it was primarily there to support outflows refugees coming from Laos or Cambodia with like the Khmer Rouge or in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. So thank you so much for sharing that and how, the IRC played such a crucial role, even if it wasn't actually able to be necessarily in country at the time.
Yeah, well, we don't go in country unless invited. But we do care for refugees who have fled. And we were not only invited, but strongly pled with to come in 2008. And even though we did not approve of the Myanmar government, we thought, well, there clearly are a lot of victims of this and we should pitch in. So that's why we didn't go in until 2008.
After the IRC was involved in Myanmar following 2008, did the military junta continue to pose problems for the IRC's operations there, or were they primarily cooperative, supportive, etc. of efforts?
Well, I would say it's not a question of their being cooperative and supportive. We were critical of the Myanmar government, and that, of course, in any authoritarian government, that word gets back to the government. So I couldn't say our relationship with the Myanmar government from 2008 on, especially once we got involved with the Rohingya refugees up in Rakhine State, that it was a terribly positive relationship. But we have continued. Because of the fact that we were welcomed by the Rohingya in particular, we have continued to work with them. Well, to be honest, I'm not completely sure the IRC is still there. I think it is, but I haven't looked at it recently.
So kind of what continue to be the IRC's main goals in terms of helping the Rohingya, either in Myanmar or also outside of Myanmar in Thailand and in Bangladesh, if you're aware of them?
Well, I mean, our goals were and are the same ones that they are in all of our involvement. Namely, if people are already refugees, we work very hard to help them to get resettled, either in the country they fled to or in the country to which they can return. In the case of the Rohingya, that's very complicated because Bangladesh was not a welcoming place. They fled there because that's the one place from the western part of Myanmar where they were that they could get to outside the country. But that was our aim when we could do it. And similarly, when for those Rohingya whose villages were burned or who were pushed out without any means of supporting themselves, we worked hard. This is now for ones that were still in Myanmar. We would have teams work, again, almost all Myanmar teams. And interestingly, not only Rohingya, and also Buddhist staff members, although the tensions were such that it was hard to get them to work together, but we really worked at that. But they would then work in terms of developing basic health care and decent water and educational programs as we do all over the world in those places. And we don't provide, armed security. So it was very, very dangerous for everybody involved, the staff members as well as the villages, as they work to get back on their feet, because the dominant Myanmar Buddhist military forces didn't want to have any of those Rohingya develop viable communities. So it's been a very tense place to be involved.
Yes. What do you think it would take for the Rohingya to be integrated back into Myanmar society if that option is either preferable or even possible for the Rohingya?
Well, I think it's preferable in the sense that they've been there for generations. They have developed land there. They can support themselves there. But it does require having the Myanmar Buddhist majority be willing to allow them to return. And that is a huge challenge. It's all especially painful because, as you probably know, Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of the liberator of Myanmar during their freedom struggles, is in jail. She was a nominal head of state in Myanmar for a number of years, but has basically been hand-tied and put in jail now by the military that is governing the country. And that makes it very difficult to see how, short of the kind of patchwork that there is now, it'll be possible to fully integrate the society. I think the time will come. There's a lot of resistance to the military rule right now. And if the resistance keeps on, and if Aung San Suu Kyi, she's now in her 70s, and so whether she or a successor winds up taking over the government, I think there is every chance that there could be a amicable, might be a little bit overstated, but nonetheless a resolution of the conflicts that allows the Rohingya as well as other persecuted groups to stay. It's not just the Rohingya. The refugees we worked with in Thailand were Karen. They were Buddhists, but they were on the other side of the country, on the eastern border of the country, and some of them have gone back and they've thrived and done well in those periods when the government was welcoming of them, but it hasn't been a consistent pattern. So Myanmar has. Well, I think Myanmar now has the longest running civil conflict in the world. I mean, it is a special case, and it does have religious nuances in the sense that the dominant groups are Buddhist and the most persecuted are Muslim. But it's not only that; it's also tensions within the Buddhist community from different tribal groups and so on. So it's a very complicated, difficult, challenging situation.
Yes, kind of building off that, what unique challenges do you think that governments with limited resources like Myanmar face in engaging with long-standing religious conflicts, especially ones, within groups, but also ones like conflict between Buddhists and Muslims in Myanmar?
Yeah, well, they have if they can get a government that deploys even the limited resources that it has, and it could get more resources if it was a government that did this, that distributed them in a way that was fair and open in terms of the various ethnic and religious groups, then it could obviously do more and would get more support. I mean, in the same way that we resisted going into Myanmar until 2008, because it seemed we did not want to be associated with the government that was generating the refugees we were caring for on the Thai border. So I would say Myanmar illustrates how challenging it is, but there is no solution unless there is an indigenous force that pushes for that kind of reconciliation. And that doesn't have to be the government, but obviously in most parts of the world, that can't happen unless the government is in favor of it.
Yes. Kind of segueing into the discussion of religion globally, more broadly, to kind of end out our interview. Do you see the contemporary rise of some conservative religious movements, for instance, growing evangelical movements in the Western Hemisphere, whether in the United States or Latin America, or the revival of the Russian Orthodox Church, among others, as a likely catalyst for new conflicts?
To be honest, don't think that those religious tensions will be the catalyst for new conflicts. I think it's more the other way around, that the political leadership has co-opted what are decent religious people to support positions that are very, very clearly in conflict with their own core religious interests. And I think that's true. It's certainly true in Russia, where the Orthodox Church has become a peon that is manipulated by Putin and other leaders. But it's also true in this country, and to a lesser extent, maybe in Latin America, for evangelicals or for conservative Christians. They're not leading. Even if evangelical Christianity took over the United States, it would not persecute, I don't know, Unitarians or Episcopalians. It might do everything it can to make sure that liberals like them were not able to get into positions of authority, and it would do that by, if need be, by manipulating the political systems so that they were, they didn't have fair voting and so on. But I don't really see on the horizon overt conflicts that are generated by the religious groups themselves. They can be part of supporting conflict, but led by others.
So it's primarily the political aspect, using religion as essentially a veil to advance, like, implicitly political motives.
I'm afraid that is what I think. I'm not proud of that, but it's because taking this, well, in Russia, the Orthodox Church, I mean, insofar as there is a vibrant religious movement in Russia, it's not the Orthodox Church. It's all other kinds of groups that are in fact protesting the government, but aren't going to lead. They're not armed. They're not going to lead to a conflict. And in this country, I think largely the same is true even with evangelicals, although some have been totally taken over by right-wing extremists.
On the other side of the ball, I suppose, are there examples you could discuss in which religion globally, I suppose, has the potential to act as a force for either conflict resolution or maintaining peace?
Well, I think that there are religious organizations that participate very seriously in trying to do that. Christian Children's Fund, just a whole range of groups, and they work hard at it. I don't see their impact is growing at the moment, and that's sad. It's sad for the world. But I think that the need is for religious communities to generate a willingness for diverse communities to work together. And there isn't a lot of impulse to do that among religious communities at the moment, as far as I can tell. They're more interested in increasing the numbers of people who identify with their community and strengthening that, which is fine. But I don't see strong movements other than some NGOs where the collaboration and the interest of enhancing prospects for peace are clearly expressed.
That's really unfortunate.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And in that vein, is there any particular region that you view as specifically vulnerable to conflict, either stemming from sort of religious divide or played on by a political authority, like as being particularly probable right now or in the near future?
Well, Myanmar is the one that you raised, and I think that clearly is an example in which until the military government does have to be overthrown, but then the tensions between the Buddhists on the one hand and other religious communities needs to be addressed, and I don't see that as happening very soon. I guess if I had to pick other areas, I would rate at the moment, regrettably, India very high. The extent to which Prime Minister Modi is basically giving up the rich tradition that India has of being a secular democratic state that respects multiple religious traditions. I don't mean it's been a perfect record. We all know that division of India and Pakistan and the driving of many Muslims out of India happened, and it's not as if the news was all good. But there was in principle a commitment to having a state that tolerated and even welcomed people, especially Muslims and Hindus, but also others. And I think the appetite for that under Prime Minister Modi has gone down precipitously, and it doesn't look to me as if that's going to turn around very quickly. So that's one area that I'm concerned about. Another is in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are many countries that we could look at. Nigeria would be a good example, where the conflict between the different ethnic and religious groups is very strong and very undermining of an effective government, and really needs to be addressed seriously with support from outside the country as well. And Nigeria is an example of other sub-Saharan African countries that also have similar problems. Well, they're all over the place.
Yeah. In that regard, what options are available to prevent or mitigate these conflicts, and what role can NGOs like the IRC play in potentially mitigating or diffusing these issues, these tensions?
Well, I think the IRC and governments outside of the governments of the countries involved can be most effective by working at the local level with and training local staff to work inside communities and develop within those communities not only a tolerance but an actual appreciation of differences that extend beyond their own tribal identities. The greatest asset that the IRC has, and the same could be said for other NGOs. I just don't know all the data for others. But the greatest asset we have for this international amelioration of conflict is the fact that we have, well, when I left, 12,000. Now it's probably more like 15 or 20,000 staff, well trained, but indigenous, and so they know the local language. They have respect and positions within their own countries and communities. The NGOs can play a significant role in making sure that women are part of the trained staff, and that in turn extends them to the position of other women in those situations. So there's a great deal that can be done, but it's got to be done at the local level, step at a time. There's no magic solution that can be announced from the UN or from the US or from any other leading country. And when the attempt is made to do that, all of us should have our crap detectors activated. The Chinese, I think, are the most likely to really pretend that when they move into a country, it's all for innocent reasons and so on. And it'll all not likely.
Yeah. So now, wanting to be respectful of your time, I'm going to round this out with one last question, kind of your typical sort of last question. What can young Americans, whether in high school or college, do to get involved or advocate for change in peaceful conflict resolution?
Oh, well, I think that all of you can and should become deeply grounded in your own traditions. And members of your own communities, and from within that setting, be able to reach out then also to others, because even in terms of reaching out to other religious traditions, the respect is going to be greater for those who are deeply grounded in their own tradition than it is for people who are, secular liberals who sort of think basically religion is a waste of time, all of it, and so they tolerate all of it. That is not going to go very far toward building real commitment. So being deeply involved and engaged in your own communities, and then working with coalitions that cut across traditional divisions, and doing that from an early age on. It can be done certainly from high school on, and can be done very effectively. And I strongly urge that be done, and I look forward to the admirable results that will eventuate.
Thank you so much, Professor Rupp, for taking this time this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I'm sure others will really appreciate hearing all you've had to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you for all your work on this project. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a very nice day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.